Hi, I'm Steven.
And I'm Jake.
Welcome to Tales from the SaaS Graveyard, where we talk to employees at tech companies that are in the middle of the bell curve, not going out of business, but definitely not hitting the big time. The SaaS Graveyard is a purgatory populated by companies that have made it to annual revenues in the 30 to 50 million range, but can't get to the next level, which is pretty impressive outside of Silicon Valley, but frowned upon here.
We interview folks in various roles about their experience working at companies like this. We're looking to see what common themes emerge across industries and roles. Today we will spend time with our friend Chris, who is the first employee at RecruitForce, a candidate screening tool for small businesses.
This is a little different than our normal shows, as Chris joined two co founders to make a three-person company. He'll walk us through his year that he spent primarily as a developer at this self funded startup as they tried to find their product market fit. Jake, we both worked at companies with under 10 people. How would you compare the experience of working at a small company to that of a large company?
So I've done it a couple times, and I really like knowing everything about the business. Sort of in a 10-person company, at least in my experience, there was sort of no secrets. Any problem affected all of us, or any success was something that all of us could celebrate together. So it really felt like you were a key to the business, and you really knew what was going on. Um, Things I didn't like is it felt very easy to change the focus of the company, whether a very important customer or an investor said something, it seemed like you that would then scramble to something else. And so it was very hard to have long-term focus when you're such a small company and things can change very quickly. How about you?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree. Being at a startup is never boring, and I think that was the really thing that I enjoyed working at a company with under 10 people was every day you knew you were providing value to the business, whether it was you needed to reply to a customer email, whether you need to refine the roadmap, pretty much you had to do everything. So you knew by default you're providing value to the business compared to where that a large company, you could be working on a project for months and then it just gets shelved at the end of the day and you kind of scratch your head and wonder, why did I even bother in the first place with that? I think the only, one of the big cons of working at a small company is, you got to work much longer hours because, the business is dependent to keep its lights on based on your efforts and what you're making happen. So there's definitely times where it's like I'm on calls at midnight, missing an improv show I might have wanted to go to. Not that that was a big deal all the time, but it can always be a little bit of a bummer when you don't really feel like you have a little bit more clear lines between work and life at a small company.
Right. Well, let's hear what Chris has to say about his time spent working at a single-digit person company. So, Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, before we dive into your role at RecruitForce, can you give us a little background of what you were doing beforehand?
Sure. So I had graduated from college about 4 years before that, and I'd spent all of my career, I guess, not counting internships, but my full-time career was all at Microsoft. I'd worked at a couple of different teams, one up in Seattle and then one down in California, and yeah, that's where I was before I went to RecruitForce.
What made you decide to leave Microsoft and look for something different?
Um, I had kind of always wanted to try entrepreneurship. I took some business classes in college to make sure that I could do that, get the background. I've always liked creating things, kind of starting them from scratch, being involved in the ground up stages. But I guess straight out of college, I had this thought that I should build my skills somewhere. Get some good experience before I went straight into the world of trying to make new things. Um, but I'd always kind of had it in the back of my head. And RecruitForce was kind of in the right place at the right time. I'd been at Microsoft, I said, about 4 years, and I was kind of thinking it was about time for a change. I also had just signed a lease on a new apartment. And this is kind of one of those San Francisco things. My new lease was a fifth of the price of my old lease.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I found one of those sweetheart deals of like a friend of a friend who had a rent controlled apartment in um, but it would have like added to my already pretty extensive commute because Microsoft was down in the valley and I was living in San Francisco, and it would have made it I think almost 2 hours each way. And so I was like, this is a good time, and they just happened to be kind of, I guess, at the right time in my life. When I was really looking to go to a startup, they happened to be the good option on the table.
So, how did you first hear about them?
It was started by a colleague of mine when I was working up in Seattle at Microsoft. And so, um, and he knew they were looking for somebody who had, um, I guess when you're a small company like that, you need somebody with sort of a variety of skills. You know, he was looking for somebody that knew like the UX side of things and the business side of things and the technical side of things. And so he'd been kind of pinging me saying, you know, like, hey, you know, we're looking for somebody who has interest, you know, in a variety of areas and can kind of do, you know, hold a variety of positions, I guess. You know, even though I technically had, you know, one position which was developer, but really, you know, I did work on the UX. I did, you know, help them with some product stuff, and so they, you know, they were looking for somebody with that sort of diverse um, interest and skill set.
And so this co-founder that you've worked with previously, what were your impressions of him before going to RecruitForce? Like, were you happy that he had reached out to you?
Yeah, he was definitely somebody I had really good, you know, camaraderie with, and I thought he generally, he'd actually come from some larger teams, and was the team that I was working on was like his. Oh, I need to be less stressed, and I'll find an easier team to work on. So I'd known his like his background was in, you know, some pretty impressive large product spaces, and so I was like, you know, this is a good dude with some good knowledge, and was hoping to, you know, I guess, you know, learn some things from him as well.
And now, like when you joined, the company was very small. So was there really much of an interviewing process, or was it just more that this guy reached out to you and then you eventually said yes?
Yeah, not no interview process at all. Actually, really, I guess because we'd, you know, we'd already worked together, and he, you know, was the founder, and I was, you know, employee number one. There were two co-founders, so he basically, you know, talked to his co-founder, and I guess there was, I wouldn't necessarily call it an interview in the sense of like I didn't get like the normal interview questions, but there was like a conversation of like talking to his co-founder about my background and my interests and learning about a little more about the company. But otherwise, I guess, you know, our experience together, you know, spoke well enough for itself. And um, I guess the other thing too is there wasn't much financial risk for them because I was almost exclusively paid in equity. And so there wasn't, it wasn't like they were, you know, shelling out, you know, tens of thousands of dollars on a risk on me. So
Right. So like if after a few weeks it wasn't working, or a few months, they could just cut their ties to you essentially.
yeah, exactly.
And were you at the before you agreed to accept? Were you looking at anywhere else, or was this the only one that only other company you were talking to?
I think I looked a couple other places that were, I guess, actually larger, still startups, but larger. You know, the 100, size companies. But I liked this one because I, like I said, I did want to build something from the ground up. It had somebody I knew and I trusted that I'd work together. I knew we could work together well. Um, and I thought it would, you know, give me some insight into. I also had this a plan to do my own startup one day, and I figured, you know, if I was along for the journey of another startup, it would give me a lot of the insights, you know, that I would hopefully be able to use on my own startup later.
You mentioned that the you were paid primarily in equity. Did that concern you at all, or was that really exciting? The thought that like, oh, I might be able to become really rich from this experience.
I think it was more of the latter mostly, and I didn't have that many expenses other than I guess rent when I was at Microsoft, you know, but I was pretty good at saving, so I wasn't in a position where like financially I didn't have any financial obligations. You know, I'd paid off my student debt by that point, and so I wasn't that concerned about not having a steady cash flow, and I was definitely like young in the valley, starstruck, like wow, equity, I could be the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next, you know, like Facebook employee number three who's, you know, now retired and a, you know, multimillionaire. Um, I think with older, more jaded eyes, I would probably be uh, not even for dollar value reasons, but for like company setup and expectation reasons, a little more skeptical of a company that doesn't have like a cash flow stream, especially in the valley, because it's like and I at the time, especially, you know, 2014, it's like cash was flowing like water, and I probably should have been more concerned about the fact that they, not that they, I didn't need the money, but I should have been more concerned about the fact that they weren't like setting themselves up to have investor cash flow.
Right. So they were completely self funded at that point, correct?
Yes, yep, exactly. Yeah, it was we had all saved up during our times at the big companies, and we were all basically living off our savings, trying to make something cool happen, which is in some ways the dream. You know, but I feel like that company startup of the idea of like friends starting in a garage off of selling their Volkswagen is more the like vintage Silicon Valley feel. It's not nowadays. It's like the I don't you don't hear that story as often anymore. It's the new story is like we got some friends, but then people gave us several $1 million.
Right. And was their idea like, oh, we're gonna try and eventually get to that point of getting someone to give us several $1 million, or was that even not even that far thought out?
They actually were more focused on trying to get a like revenue positive business model. So we talked about some different varieties of like ways to get users to pay. Um, I would say there's I guess kind of two sides to that. One's good and like there's a the good side of that is I think Silicon Valley often will only fund things if they think they're going to be a unicorn, because it's like if you're going to take a risk on a company, take a risk on one that could really be big. And I'm not sure small business recruiting ever fit that profile. On the other hand, I think that focus on trying to find a revenue positive business model kept us from doing the like rapid growth and like pedal to the metal kind of mentality that a lot of startups do that would have been, I think, beneficial to trying to break out of the SaaS graveyard.
Is there one piece of information you wish you had before you started, or one thing you wish you asked during that very informal interview process?
I think I would have liked to have asked about how the company would be set up and what my role in it would be a little more. I guess I had naturally assumed because I was employee number 3 that I would be very hands-on in the product direction and very hands-on in the company direction. And um, I would say that that didn't really turn out to be true. In a lot of cases, it was like it felt like I was kind of the third wheel. Like the two founders were the ones setting the direction, and I was sort of just expected to go with it. And it was very different to I had a friend with the startup who I would actually hang out with at least like once a month. I would go over and they would always do like startup dinners, and I would hang out with the people who were there. And it felt their startup felt a lot more like a family, and everyone was very involved in what was happening and very hands on. And I was expecting that sort of feel, and I guess I didn't know enough at the time to ask, or to try and figure that out. I just sort of naturally assumed that was how startups operated, and this one didn't feel that way. I'm kind of bummed to say.
In this new role, were you working remotely, or did you actually have an office space that you were going and meeting with the two other founders?
We were remote. We were all remote, which was one of the perks. There was one of the things that I really liked about the job was that I didn't have the commute anymore. Like I said, that was
Hmm.
a big downside to being at Microsoft. It allowed me to live in San Francisco, and like I had a pretty flexible schedule, which was fun. But there are definitely like downsides to not seeing each other. And the other two were in Seattle, and so they could like meet in person over coffee to review designs and things like that. And it was more difficult for me to join them. Um, I think in the pandemic, like one of the things that works better about remote working is that like everyone's doing it, and it's harder when you're the only person who's remote and the other two are, I guess they were working from home, but they were close enough that they could meet, which I guess made them semi-remote. Um, so that was maybe not an ideal setup either.
So then, what did your first month look like at the company?
It's a little strange. Like day one is a little odd when you're at a company small enough. They don't have like an HR staff, right, or an onboarding program of any sort, and so it was kind of just like, hey, sign on to when Slack didn't exist then, I don't think, or at least we didn't have it. It was like sign on to I'm trying to even remember. I think it was Skype we used. It's like sign on to Skype and like join this group chat and like, hey, now we're here. And then they gave me, I guess, pretty quickly off some kind of, I would say, not very high level, like just pretty uh, grunt worky coding tasks to start off with. Doing some like UI refactoring, and I spent, I guess, the first few months working a lot on scraping tools. So they were starting to try and pull in for the people that did have like LinkedIn pages, or maybe like if we could find their Facebook profile. So I started writing some tools that would help with that, which was um, interesting. And this is also when I was at Microsoft, I was a PM, and so jumping into like writing scraping tools was definitely a big transition.
Hmm.
And then I also wrote a couple of like browser plugins that would help people. What did those even do? It was like it would help. It would link out to like people's profiles, so it would help like you find those people if they were on their either social sites or their LinkedIn. Um, and so yeah, it was interesting. I wouldn't say my first couple of months felt like I was doing things that were core to the product. It felt like I was doing things that were maybe farther down the checklist that they were like, well, we can at least, let him cut his teeth on these before we have him contributing to the big code base.
Oh God! So you were working on all the kind of special projects area, not even necessarily to the core business.
Yeah, yeah, that's what it felt like, which was for somebody who was expecting maybe a startup with a leadership role and like we could all be in exciting discussions of product and market fit and you know it was definitely maybe not the first beginning that I expected.
Got it. And did you bring this up at all with the founders?
So I think I was the first couple of months I was too nice. I wanted to make a good impression. That I was going to be a good part of the startup. Um, Eventually, I did like I'd say maybe a couple months in, I started asking about like hey, like when are we going to do like UX reviews or like are we going to do product meetings? Like are we going to and um, I got maybe a lukewarm reception to that. They were like, "Oh yeah," like they weren't really excited to have me in that. They were like, "I guess we could do some of that sometimes," um, and which I guess is that's where one of the signs, one of the road posts along the way of like, "Oh, this is not exactly the thing that I envisioned it would be."
Hmm. Was there like new hires coming on as well, or was it just the three of you?
Yeah, they would. So over the course of my year, they would occasionally bring people in. So it would sort of fluctuate with like a couple other people. I was the only one who was like full time, but they would bring in like a UX guy for a couple of months. They brought in another coder for a number of months as well. Um, a lot of times, I think it was like they were people who maybe were doing this as like a side project after work and not as their full time job. And those people, I mean, they were all. I have mostly positive memories of everyone that was involved. We were always happy to have the help and make more progress on our objectives. I did. I don't know that this is a this didn't answer my goal of wanting to be a product person, but it did. It did at least I did at least get more traction in working on the larger code base, the main product after a couple of months, which was nice. Because you get to I get to actually do things that were a little more central to the company mission and our goals. Um,
Hmm.
Although the other the co so it was like of the two co-founders, there was one that did a lot more code and one that did like a lot more sales and product. And the one who like did the code was sometimes kind of protective and was like very particular about coding. And I guess he got in the mindset of like code should be done in a very particular way, whereas I felt like startup code should be scrappy and wasn't it wasn't as important. I didn't feel it was as important to have like a style guide or a technical direction in a startup
Hmm.
as it was in a bigger company.
I'm curious. So I know you mentioned it was remote and it was kind of you had a flexible work schedule, but what was it like waking up till when you signed off for the night? What were those interactions like? Was there a lot of interaction, or was it just Chris coding alone?
A little more of the latter than I would like, I think. Maybe that's I think of the lessons we could learn, certainly one of them would be like creating a company feel in a distributed company is difficult but extremely important. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it would usually be like I would log on and like say hello just so like, and we would do maybe like 5 minutes of small talk so that like people would know who was online. Um, and there wasn't like usually a set schedule. We didn't even have that many meetings either. It would mostly be like, oh, I would say hello and I would let them know what I was working on. We didn't do like an official stand up, but I guess we kind of did like an ad hoc where you know I would just kind of message what I was working on, and then I would work on it for a while. Take a break for lunch or whatever, and um, I guess maybe like once or twice a week I'd bother them for like code reviews, but it wasn't. you know, it's certainly a stark contrast to like my buddy's startup where it was like they have dinner together every night and like, they have like they'll rotate who cooks and like, they were like everyone was excited about what they were doing and would talk about it a lot. And, it was like even not working for that company and just going over there to hang out with people, like I could get the vibe of like what was
Hmm.
going on and I would like get a little excited about their product. And I think that was missing. And, I not to say that remote stuff can't be done, but I think you have to be very aware and intentional,
Yeah.
especially with a small company at how you create the vibe.
Were you aware at all of how the business was doing in terms of like gaining customers, or was that completely hidden from you?
So we did actually talk about that. It's interesting. We probably talked more about that than product design, because we would talk about like if features were being used. As on the technical side, I did um, a lot of data pulls too. So in addition to like the code, I would we would use Splunk or whatever manual searching to pull some of the data and figure out if our features were being used, and do some of the. We would actually like our customer base was small enough that like some of them we knew like we could actually message and just say like, hey, we made this new feature, can you try it out and email us back what you think, and they would actually do it, which was pretty cool. Um, and but I guess it's like I financially I knew we never hit a level while I was there that we would have been like long term sustainable in terms of like paying our own salaries. But we did talk a lot about we tried probably 6 or 7 different business models while I was there of like, and this is like also I guess atypical for a startup, right? Is like we spent that whole first year like kind of trying business models as opposed to like trying just to get users. Um, and yeah, but we tried probably 6 or 7 different business models of like a monthly fee, or do you like pay for number of clients you're managing or number of job postings, or we tried a bunch of different methods. We even tried like we tried supplier side too, where it was like, or I should say applicant side, where it was like if we find you a job, pay us this like a set fee. Um, and we tried a bunch of different things. I wouldn't say we found one that's stick. I guess it's good to try things and try to figure out what works. But I feel like there's a critical mass part that was missing of like we were trying to focus on how to get people to pay for something, and it's hard sometimes to make something useful enough to pay for without a big enough audience, if that makes sense. It's like Facebook couldn't have charged for ads when they only had 1,000 users, right? It's like who's going to pay
Hmm.
for ads that only reach 15 people? And so it's kind of like until we had a critical mass of people that were on the platform, I don't know that any revenue strategy would have really worked.
Yeah, no, that definitely it seems like a bit of a maybe putting the cart before the horse a little bit of let's worry about our business model when we don't even know we have something worth buying in any regard.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And we were trying to judge whether our product was valuable by whether people would pay for it, which I think is a model that works. I mean, it works if you get a yes, it works, but if you get a no, it's not a reliable no. If your question is will people pay for it and the answer is no, that doesn't always mean your product is bad or your idea is bad. Sometimes it means you're not far enough along your road yet. I think sometimes about how in college everyone thought Google buying YouTube was stupid. They were like, their bandwidth bills are enormous. Everything's free. Like, this is going to end up being a real boondoggle. And now it's like an enormous moneymaker. And it's like, oh, they just weren't, it wasn't that their product was bad. They just weren't far enough along their path yet that it was like, a moneymaker.
What's the thing you're most proud of that you worked on there?
The thing that and this is, this is going to sound silly because from a product perspective, it was maybe not that impressive, but from a technical perspective, it was cool. We did like an analysis engine that would help flag resumes that were the most interesting. So we like wrote a little engine that would like try to parse resumes, and so it could say like if somebody had a like for example a 10 years of experience between different restaurants working as a server, we would try to like pull that out of the resume and flag that person had a bunch of service experience, and so they were a good candidate to talk to in the beginning. And that was technically complicated and kind of a had some cool smarts to it. Um,
Hmm.
so from like a geeky perspective, I would say that's probably my proudest achievement. Even though from like a product perspective, it didn't make that much impact. I think people were actually using the CRM tools more just to flag who they'd interviewed. And our tools would let them like talk to who you talk to, how many times you talk to them, like what part of the interview process you were in, how many, what they're, and you could take little notes that said like, oh, I asked them about their time at, TGI Fridays and they said they hated it or whatever. Um, and so I think people use those tools, the manual tools, more. In fact, I know they did because we did, like I said, I did the data polls. But it was still cool to work on the automation, stuff. And I think, if we'd been a larger size company, people might have, people, and we had a wider user base, people might have, used that even more.
And I guess what's your most memorable day when you were there, either good or bad?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think my most memorable day was the probably my last day, which is I guess on the bad side, but I like I definitely remember, you know, the day that we'd been going back and forth with some of these business models, and there was like a day where we just finished a trial of one of them, and one of the founders just like messaged me and was like, "Hey," and that was a phone call. He was decent enough to do a phone call, and he was just like, "Hey, I don't really know what direction we're gonna go in, but we're not really happy with where things have been going with the CRM side of things. So we're gonna like take a couple of weeks and try to think about where we want to pivot to." And there was like this awkward long pause, and then I was like, "Okay, so what do you need me to do in the meantime?" And there was like another kind of awkward pause, and he's like, "Well, I don't think we have anything for you right now, and I'm sorry, but he's like, I'm sorry that that's kind of boring, but I do think maybe we'll come up with something interesting. So I guess just hold tight for a couple weeks." And that was like a very awkward conversation. I was like, okay, so I guess I'll just because I guess kudos to him that he at least didn't give me busy work. That he was upfront with me to say we don't really know where we're going, so don't waste your time spinning your wheels on something we want to do. Um, so that was definitely memorable as the sense of like it's it was awkward and that sticks in your mind, but also um, that was kind of maybe the moment where I was like, this is not heading in a direction that we feel confident about. Um,
Hmm.
at the end of those 2 weeks, like he came back and told me about the pivot. So they were pivoting to try to help with diversity and recruiting, which in 2014 was actually pretty far ahead of its time. And I don't think I anticipated, um, that here in 2020 we would have as much of a push for it as we do. Um, but it was like that's such a drastic product change, to go from all
Hmm.
these, and they basically took all the CRM tools that we've been working on for a while, and it was like, oh no, we're not gonna use any of these. And I was frankly pretty bummed about that because people like the CRM tools, and I'd worked on those, and I thought we were solving real user problems, and we were solving real user problems, but they weren't making us enough revenue to keep going with it. And so that was, I guess, depressing in a like mildly depressing. I wasn't like I didn't launch into like a life depressive moment, but
Hmm.
it was a sad ending. This was a video game, that would be the sad ending, not the happy ending. And yeah, so and that was when I took my leave of the project. Basically said my like, hey, thank you. It's been a good journey. We ended on a high note. I still talk to the guy. Um, we're still on positive terms. But uh, yeah, that was just where we decided to part ways. And they kept working on it for 2 or 3 years after I left, and I guess grew it to 10 or 15 employees and got an acquihire, which like an acquihire is definitely better than closing down, but it's not it's not the success that anyone hopes for in the space. It's solidly in SaaS graveyard territory.
Hmm.
So um, I guess one other memorable day is like the day that they told me the pivot, and then I was like, and then the next day when I kind of told them that I thought about the pivot and was not going to stay around for it, and my boss was like asking me about, like, what do you think you'll do, and I told him like some of my startup like personal startup ideas, and he was like, actually, those ideas sound really cool. If I were you, like, I wouldn't blame you if you decided to go for one of those instead of ours. Like, heck, like those are good. And I was like, cool. I mean, it made me feel good about my ideas. But it was, yeah, it was all yeah, memorable. I guess the end is always memorable.
Prior to them saying that, we're going to do a pause on what we've been doing and we're going to rethink the business, had you been thinking of leaving on your own terms before that?
I mean, like I said, I still had the opportunity to go with them after the pivot too. So, uh, it was, I guess I had been stagnating a little bit. I could, at that point, we were up to, trial number 6 or whatever of the business models. And it was like, I kind of felt like there wasn't a lot of direction. So I guess the short answer is yes. Yes, I had thought about leaving because I felt like there wasn't a lot of direction, and obviously there was this misalignment with, like, I wanted to be involved. In fact, it's also, in retrospect, immensely frustrating. Like, their response was, "We're gonna think about the pivot and get back to you," instead of, "Hey, can you, like, help us think through this pivot?" And, like, that's
Right.
the role I really wanted to be in. And so when you combine, like, the stagnation of the company with, like, my own personal, like, wanting to be in a more exciting role, it was definitely, a time where I was not super happy with how things had gone, and didn't feel like there was a bright future ahead, and yeah, had been thinking about, is this something I want to stick with, or move on from.
Right, but if they had said instead, like, "Hey, fly up to Seattle for next week, and like let's all sit down in a room together and come up with like what do we want to do the next 3 months," you might have been more interested in that pivot if you had been part of it.
Oh, yeah, I think so, for sure. If it had been, like, something we all came up with together, and I, like, knew the rationale for it and felt like it had a bright future, and that I'd had a say in it, yeah, I would have been a lot more interested in hanging around for that, for sure.
Did they ever fly you up to all be in the same room, or was it always just virtual?
A couple of times, yeah. Actually, we combined it with, like, I still have friends in Seattle, so I probably go up there, like, once a year, and so, like, a couple of times I was just like, "Oh, like, this would be a good week to, like, I'll come up, like, we'll do a couple 2 or 3 days of work in the office, and then, like, I'll, hang out for a weekend with my friends, and then, head back down." So we did have some in-person planning sessions. It was, good to see people in person. But it didn't really, I guess, cross the gap of, feeling like I was that third wheel.
Got it. So even in person, you never felt like, "Oh, I'm part of this. I'm part of this decision making process."
Not as much. I mean, it was better. It was better to be there, and be talking to them, and and when you have a whole day in person, eventually, like, we didn't have, like, enough code to fill up like a we didn't have enough technical discussions to fill up a whole day, so inevitably, like, it would turn to product, or business direction. But it was never, like, in a place where it was like, it felt like I wasn't up there for that purpose, I guess. They weren't like, come up here so we can talk about product. It was like, come up here so we can, like, have an in-person time, and we'll work on some code, and then product happened to be a thing that came up, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
yeah, it
Um,
was I wish it had been felt more involved, for sure.
right. So when you did, in fact decide to leave, you mentioned earlier that you've been paid considerably in equity. Did you decide to keep your equity, and were there options that you had to exercise, or how did that work?
So unfortunately, it was because they were pivoting so much. Uh, it was like, well, the stuff that you worked on is basically folding, and we're kind of starting a new thing. And so and I guess I'm still a little sore about that they effectively folded the company that I was working for, so the equity wasn't worth anything, and then started a new company.
But
Um,
just still the same two guys,
right, the
essentially.
same two guys, different title. They renamed it, like I said. So that was the thing, was like, I don't know if they took any of the code that I worked on. So, like, in a sense, it was like, that was like, I was frustrated that I wasn't getting any money out of it, but at the same time, I was like, I don't know that we actually contributed anything to their new project. Like, they really did kind of do a hard reset, and it's like, well, mainly the thing they got out of the company that I worked for was the like knowledge of how the recruiting industry worked and how company hiring practices worked. The technical side of it, I don't think they really got much out of.
Right.
So it was, I mean, I don't, I guess I'm being more open with you guys about that than I have. I don't, most people have not asked about that, but it was not, not, that was probably my least favorite part of the company, honestly. It's like the realization that I put a whole year of work into a product that was basically, that was folding and I wouldn't get anything out of it is like, even more so than the frustrating experiences at the company is like, crushing.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know what you could really do in that situation if that's, if you have any recourse or what are your options really at that point.
Yeah, exactly. I think if one of the things, so you learn a lot of things in life, and like one of the things that I learned out of this experience is definitely like even in small scrappy situations, like make sure that you more intentionally like set things up, and it's like nobody wants to talk about the future of like what happens if this turns into like a real graveyard scenario where it's like folded, but
Mhm.
you have to have those hard conversations. You can't just ignore them. Otherwise, it makes things even more unpleasant. Um, and I think if I were to do an opportunity like this again, I would like definitely have both um, more explicit like in writing what would happen if the company pivoted or what would happen if the company closed. And also, like I said, I don't think I would go for a company unless it was my own. I don't think I would go for a company just on equity because and again, not for monetary reasons. Like I didn't end, in poverty, but it's just not. I don't think it's a healthy company dynamic to not have cash flow, even if the cash flow is not from customers and profit. Like having some engine is like it just promotes activity and progress and I think a healthier mindset than just like, oh well, the attitude like that we described at the beginning of like, oh well, if it doesn't work out we'll just like part ways is a very risk averse attitude, which is and it does mean that like you don't have a lot to lose, but I don't know that like leaning that hard on like risk aversion is good. Sorry, I know
I,
we're getting a little in the weeds here, but does that
No,
make
I agree with you. I think if there's no money, no one takes it seriously enough. Like you have to, like if they had to pay you a little bit more money, it's like, well, do we really need this third person here? Because we are giving some of our money to him. It makes them take everything a little bit more seriously, and they'd probably, treat you as such.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's an element too to like how much time we spent trying different ways to get people to pay is like that was kind of that was because of their like and maybe this is I guess another takeaway too is like we were focusing on the wrong things. Like right, we were trying to focus on like how do we get a business positive revenue model, and that was like not the right focus. And we spent if I think if we'd had like you said a monetary incentive to take things seriously, we would have spent less time trying to focus on how to get these little small wins and how to get people to pay us $10 a month, and we would have focused more on like how do we turn this into a business that has like real traction and a big customer base because $10 a month, you have to get a lot of people at $10 a month to pay the bills for software developers, which is yeah. So it's a tough road to climb.
Now, so you mentioned at the start that you wanted a startup experience. Have you since leaving? Have you done another startup, and did this experience help out?
Yeah, I did another startup with a couple of friends. After that, different lessons from that one, but I do think that my experience at RecruitForce definitely helped in terms of like appreciating industry connections and focusing on product development more so than like business model. Those sorts of lessons definitely helped out. I learned a lot that I applied to that, and I learned a lot that I will apply to like any future startup. I'm at a big company right now, but hopefully in the future sometime I will uh, you know do a smaller. I want to do a smaller company again in my career for sure, or even a tiny startup like that. And um, I think knowing some of the warning signs and gotchas and that kind of thing is immensely helpful. It helps you. I think the most helpful thing is always to pick the right opportunity. Looking at it, it's like you can try to change the company that you're in, or you can try to influence things. But the easiest thing to do is to like pick the right opportunity from the beginning, rather than trying to shift what is maybe a stagnated company into a positive direction.
Definitely. And so our always our closing question, if you had a time machine, can go back to early 2014, and this co-founder is asking you to join, would you still take the offer knowing what you know now, having had that experience?
Uh, I wouldn't take it on the same terms. I would definitely negotiate to be like another co-founder, um, with like more explicit involvement in the company direction, and try to make it like a trio of co-founders, or I would have been out. I think there are companies where being employee number one is very lucrative and exciting, um, and this was not one of them. And I think, like, knowing that in retrospect, it's like either I would have had to have been in a role where I could turn this into a more lucrative company, or at least be more involved and get more out of it, or um, it's not worth. That company was not structured to be a huge growth company that's where it's being employee one's going to turn into like a really exciting high power position. So yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, under different terms, maybe if I'd been a co-founder, but not as employee number one, not for that opportunity for sure.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing all of your experiences with us and for joining us today.
Oh no, my pleasure, and I hope someone listening gets some value out of it, and can avoid getting stuck in the SaaS graveyard. So I guess that's also one thing is like too is if you can recognize these warning signs, you can like at least you have the opportunity to jump sooner. You don't have to wait a whole year to recognize and go like, hey, this is not working out. And hopefully some of those warning signs help people recognize if they're stuck in stagnation land, and get to somewhere more exciting.
Another great episode. I think the interesting thing from Chris's experience, you could definitely hear that he felt like, he wasted a little bit of a year working at RecruitForce. And I think it really comes down to how you define wasted at the end of the day. If you're talking about opportunity cost as far as financially, potentially, Chris was being paid purely in equity that ended up not being worth anything at the end of the day. And if he worked at a larger company, he definitely would have been able to, get some more money in, put some more money in his 401k and stuff, but he might not have learned as much at the end of the day. So, it might have been a waste from a financial standpoint, but, he might have gotten a lot more learnings at Recruitforce.
I think he also had the sense of the wasted year a little bit because they basically threw out all the code that he'd worked on. They been the company started new from scratch, and so I think some of his feeling of like, oh, this was a waste is because nothing that he did that sort of lived on. But in my experience, that always happens anyways. That everything that we're working on will eventually get shut down. I once worked at a division of a larger company for years, and then shortly after I left, that division was shut down, and it made me really think that all those meetings that I was so concerned about, all those presentations that kept me up at night, it was really all for naught. That eventually that business goes away, and eventually all these businesses are going to go away, and yes, I think you really have to focus more on the experience of what you're learning, of the interactions you're having, and not think so much of like, am I going to be at this company that's going to live on forever? Because none of them will. Um, another frustration that Chris talked about was that he joined thinking that he's going to be essentially like a third co-founder, that he was going to have a lot of impact in decisions of how the company was going to go, but it really sounded like the founders just almost wanted like this. A lackey, for lack of a better word, but someone who would just do the work that they needed done, do the grunt work. That they were the ones who were thinking about the direction of the business, but they just needed kind of another set of hands, and that's how they viewed Chris. And I think that disconnect is something that I've seen quite a bit in my work experience, where someone is hired for one reason, uh, that the people who are doing the hiring think of him as doing X, Y, Z, but in their own minds they're going to be doing A, B, C. And I've seen this especially true, I think, at the executive level, where they'll hire a new head of marketing or head of product, and they come in with all their ideas of what they've done at previous companies, but actually the CEO, they have this complete other expectations of that may have worked for you in the past, but I kind of need this different thing, and that disconnect usually ends with someone leaving with a broken heart in under a year.
Yeah, it usually does end in broken hearts. Fortunately for them, at the executive level, they understand the life of corporate business and kind of how things can play out. Unfortunately for Chris, though, he even had this disconnect, even though he already knew one of the co-founders from his previous work experience, and maybe even consider that person a friend. And I think that really does play into the whole awkwardness of when you're recruiting for a role at your company, of recruiting a friend versus recruiting a stranger. At the end of the day, when you're recruiting a stranger, you're definitely painting that picture with the rose-colored glasses on about how great everything at the company is and how that person can grow their career and what a great time they're going to have. But when you're recruiting a friend, it's very much a little bit of the opposite. You're painting all the bad stuff because you don't want this person joining and then blaming you for joining a company that wasn't actually going anywhere or had all these problems that you didn't tell them about. And it doesn't sound like, even though Chris was friends with this person, that he got the full honest feedback of where his role was going to be and the reality of what his day-to-day life was going to be at RecruitForce. And with that, thanks for listening to episode 12. We're excited to bring you episode 13 shortly. Thanks for listening.